The flight had been in the air for about an hour. Most passengers had settled into that quiet mid-flight rhythm where time seems to stretch. Some watched movies with their headphones on, others scrolled endlessly through their phones, and a few had already drifted into sleep. The hum of the engines was steady, almost comforting. In seat 20D, the woman sat upright, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Her posture carried a quiet confidence, the kind that didn't demand attention but naturally earned it. Outside the window, clouds stretched like soft white blankets beneath the plane. Every so often, sunlight broke through, scattering golden reflections on the wings. She glanced out for a moment, her eyes scanning the horizon, not with idle curiosity, but with the focus of someone who knew what she was looking at. A few rows ahead, a group of college students were chatting loudly about their travel plans. Behind her, a man complained about the coffee being too weak. It was a typical flight scene, ordinary, unremarkable, and yet something subtle in the air felt different. The flight attendant sensed it first. It wasn't that anything was wrong. It was just that the woman in 20D had a kind of calm that didn't quite fit the rest of the cabin. When the captain's voice came over the speakers, everyone turned slightly to listen. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making a brief adjustment to our route. There's a scheduled military training exercise in our vicinity, so air traffic control has advised a small detour. Nothing to worry about." The passengers exchanged curious looks. Some pressed their faces to the windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of fighter jets. The woman didn't react much. She simply adjusted her seatbelt slightly and looked outside again, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as if she could already see what others couldn't. A middle-aged man sitting in 20C leaned toward her with an easy smile. "Guess we might see some action today, huh?" She turned her head politely and smiled back. "Maybe, but it's just a routine exercise. They'll stay clear of us." The man nodded, clearly impressed by her certainty. "You sound like you know these things." She gave a small shrug. "Just read a lot about it, I guess." It wasn't exactly a lie, but not quite the truth either. The hum of conversation in the cabin grew as passengers peered through the windows. Then someone pointed. "Look, out there." Far in the distance, cutting through the clouds like streaks of silver lightning, were two faint silhouettes. Fighter jets. Their sleek shapes glinted under the sun, their movements impossibly smooth and precise. A soft buzz of excitement spread through the cabin. Phones came out. People leaned across seats, whispering and pointing. Even the flight attendants paused to take a look when they passed by. It wasn't often that anyone got to see military jets this close during a commercial flight. One of the attendants, a young woman with a cheerful tone, stopped beside 20D and smiled. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" The woman nodded slightly. "It is. They're keeping a clean formation." "That's good flying." The attendant blinked, surprised by the phrasing. "You sound like you've done this before." "Just a habit," the woman said softly, turning her gaze back to the window. The jets were getting closer now, visible enough for their shapes to become clear. Twin tails, sleek fuselage, the distinctive curve of F-22 Raptors. Their movement was almost hypnotic, a dance in the open sky. The passengers cheered when one jet briefly tilted its wings, flashing its silver underside before leveling again. The man in 20C laughed. "Look at that. They're showing off for us." The woman gave a small laugh too, but her eyes stayed focused. Not showing off. Checking positions. She leaned slightly forward, her fingers resting on the armrest. Years of training flickered quietly in her expression. Every small adjustment of those jets meant something to her. Their distance, their timing. Even the way the sunlight hit their wings told her they were in sync. She could almost predict the next move. Then the jet on the left dipped slightly lower and pulled back into line, creating a perfect triangle shape with its partner. The woman's eyes softened. "Still sharp," she murmured under her breath. The man beside her glanced over. "What's that?" "Nothing," she said quickly with a polite smile. The flight attendant returned to her duties, though she found herself glancing back at 20D a few times. There was something intriguing about her, too composed, too familiar with what was happening outside. She wasn't panicked, excited, or even curious. She looked like someone who had already been in that world before. As the plane adjusted its altitude slightly, a low ripple of wind brushed against the fuselage. The passengers felt it but didn't react much. The woman, however, glanced toward the wing and then back to the jets. She could almost feel the timing of the pilot's communication. Her instincts told her they had just completed a loop maneuver below them, circling before returning to their position. For a few minutes, everything settled again. The passengers went back to their movies and snacks. The hum returned. But then the cockpit door opened slightly, and one of the flight attendants entered with a message from the captain. When she came back through the aisle, her face looked curious. She stopped beside the woman in 20D again. "Excuse me," she said softly. "The captain just mentioned that the military jet sent a courtesy notification through air traffic control. Apparently they wanted us to know they were aware of our flight path." The woman nodded, not surprised. "Standard protocol when commercial aircraft are nearby." The attendant smiled awkwardly. "Right, of course. Just never heard of it happening before." The woman gave her a reassuring nod. "You'll probably remember it, though." The attendant laughed lightly, still puzzled before moving on. Outside, the two F-22s continued their formation, staying at a respectful distance but maintaining visual contact. To most passengers, it was a rare thrill, something to post about later. To the woman in 20D, it was something else entirely. Watching them stirred a quiet ache she had learned to bury over the years. Those machines had once been her world. Every screw, every control input, every heartbeat inside the cockpit. Seeing them now was like seeing an old life flying parallel to her, close enough to touch yet impossibly far away. She shifted slightly in her seat, brushing her thumb against the edge of her sleeve. There was a faint mark on her wrist, a thin scar, barely visible now. It was from years ago, from a test flight gone wrong, one she rarely thought about anymore. But now, as the jets moved gracefully through the sky, that memory returned like a distant echo. The man in 20C leaned toward the window again. "They're incredible. I always wondered what kind of people fly those." "They're the best," she said simply. "Trained for precision, discipline, and trust. It's not easy." "You sound like you know them personally," he said with a chuckle. Her lips curved slightly. "Maybe once upon a time." He didn't catch the deeper meaning in her words. But for her, that once carried years of training, endless missions, and a piece of herself left behind in the sky. The captain's voice came on again. "Folks, if you look out the right-hand side, you can still see the Raptors maintaining their pattern. We'll be flying near them for just a few more minutes before we continue north." That announcement reignited the cabin's excitement. People leaned toward the windows, snapping photos and whispering in amazement. One child in the aisle seat clapped and shouted, "They're protecting us." The woman smiled faintly at that. In a way, the child wasn't wrong. For a moment, time slowed. The sunlight caught the silver edges of the jets, painting them gold. The woman's reflection overlapped with their shape on the window, a quiet reminder of who she once was. She didn't move, didn't blink. She simply watched. As the jets began to drift slightly away, she tilted her head and whispered almost to herself, "Good job, boys." No one heard her. But outside, as if by some invisible signal, one of the F-22s tilted its wings again. A slow, graceful gesture before straightening and speeding ahead. The other followed suit. The passengers clapped, thinking it was all a show. Laughter filled the cabin. The captain chuckled over the speaker. "Seems like we've made some friends today." But the woman in 20D knew better. That wasn't a random display. Wing rocking wasn't for fun, it was a sign of respect. A message. Her eyes softened. Maybe they recognized her. Maybe not. But something deep in her heart told her that somewhere in those cockpits, one or both pilots knew exactly who she was. She sat back, taking a slow breath. Her expression unreadable, but her eyes glimmering with emotion. The engines hummed steadily. The passengers went back to their routines, and the sky stretched endlessly ahead. To everyone else, it was just a detour through restricted airspace. To her, it was the beginning of something unexpected, an echo from her past flying alongside her, waiting to be acknowledged. The woman in 20D closed her eyes for a moment and let the memories come quietly. The smell of jet fuel, the vibration of the controls, the voice of her old instructor saying, "Trust your instincts up there." The sky remembers its own. When she opened her eyes again, the F-22s were just two faint dots in the distance, but the feeling they left behind lingered. Familiar, powerful, and alive. And though no one else noticed, she knew the story of that sky wasn't finished yet. The sun had begun to set somewhere behind the endless curtain of clouds. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the passengers settled in for the long stretch of the flight. The steady hum of the engines filled the space with a quiet rhythm. the kind of background sound that became almost comforting after hours in the air. Most people were half asleep or watching movies, unaware that something unusual was still happening outside. The woman in seat 20D sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the window. The faint glow from the wing light reflected across her face. She looked peaceful, but her mind was far from calm. The two F-22s that had appeared earlier hadn't gone far. Even from a distance, she could sense them. There was a particular feeling that came from knowing someone was flying formation nearby, a presence you could almost feel in your bones. Then it happened. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the first jet reappear, smooth, precise, and moving in perfect coordination. A moment later, the second one followed. The passengers started to notice again. Someone gasped. Someone else laughed softly and whispered, "They're back." Within seconds, nearly everyone on the right side of the plane was peering through the windows. Phones came out again, flashes of excitement filled the air. Even the flight attendants paused to look. There was something mesmerizing about seeing those jets so close, their gray bodies gliding through the golden light of sunset like mechanical eagles. One of the attendants passed by 20D and stopped. "Looks like they're putting on a show for us again," she said cheerfully. The woman smiled faintly. "It's not a show. It's communication." The attendant blinked, unsure what she meant, but before she could ask, the captain's voice came through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, some of you might have noticed the aircraft flying nearby. They're part of a U.S. Air Force training mission, and we've been in coordination with them through air traffic control. Everything's perfectly normal, and we've been asked to maintain our altitude while they finish their route." There was a small pause before the captain added, in a slightly amused tone, "They also asked us to relay a special acknowledgement to one of our passengers." The cabin fell silent. Heads turned, eyes wide, waiting. The captain continued, "It appears that one of their commanding officers recognized a name on our passenger list. They've asked us to pass along their respects to the person seated in row 20, seat D." For a moment, no one moved. Then all eyes turned toward the middle of the cabin. The woman in 20D felt the attention land on her like a sudden weight. She didn't move at first, just stared out the window. The F-22s outside were perfectly aligned, their wings glinting in the dying sunlight. A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. "Row 20? Who's in 20D? What's going on?" The man beside her leaned back and stared at her, eyes wide with disbelief. "Wait, are they talking about you?" She gave a small, calm smile. "Looks like it." The attendant who had spoken to her earlier hurried toward the cockpit, probably to confirm what everyone already suspected. When she returned, her face was full of curiosity and a touch of awe. "The captain says the message was very specific," she said quietly. "They requested acknowledgement to seat 20D. Do you know them?" The woman sighed softly, almost as if she'd expected this to happen someday but never quite knew when. "Yes," she said finally. "I know who they are. Or at least I knew their kind." The attendant waited for her to say more, but she didn't. She only turned her head slightly toward the window again, her expression softening as she watched the fighter jets glide closer. The passengers started whispering again, a mix of confusion and excitement. Someone said, "She must be important." Another murmured, "Maybe she's military." The woman in 20D didn't answer any of it. She just kept watching the sky. Then one of the F-22s dipped slightly, tilting its wings twice before steadying again. To most, it looked like a simple maneuver. To her, it meant everything. She remembered the first time she learned that signal. It wasn't just emotion. It was a language in itself. A tilt of respect. A wordless salute between those who shared the air. Her chest tightened as she realized what was happening. Those weren't just random pilots. They knew exactly who she was. The man next to her leaned closer. "What does that mean? Why'd they do that?" She took a slow breath before answering. "It's a sign of respect," she said quietly. "They're saluting someone." He frowned. "Who?" She turned her gaze from the window and looked straight ahead. "Me?" He blinked in surprise. "Wait, you're serious?" She nodded slightly. "Yes, I trained pilots like them once." The man stared at her, speechless for a long moment. "You mean you were a pilot?" "I was," she said softly. "A long time ago." The whispers around her grew louder. A few passengers tried to glance discreetly at her, though curiosity was impossible to hide. Even the crew seemed stunned. The captain came out of the cockpit briefly, looking a little uncertain, and approached her seat. He crouched beside her, speaking in a respectful tone. "Ma'am," he said, "the F-22 unit identified you through air traffic control. They said to tell you they're honored to share the sky with you." The cabin went quiet again. The passengers who overheard couldn't believe what they were hearing. The captain smiled slightly, waiting for her reaction. She only nodded, her voice low but steady. "Tell them the honor is mutual." He nodded, clearly impressed, and returned to the cockpit. A few moments later, the F-22s pulled slightly ahead of the passenger plane, flying side by side in perfect formation. Their presence wasn't threatening. It was graceful, protective almost. The woman in 20D kept her eyes on them, and for a moment the noise of the cabin faded away. She wasn't on a commercial flight anymore. In her mind, she was back in her training jet, helmet on, hands firm on the controls, feeling the vibration of power beneath her fingertips. She could hear the voice of her old instructor in her headset, calm but sharp. "Remember, precision isn't about control. It's about trust." She had lived by that lesson. Every maneuver she'd ever taught, every test flight she'd survived, every pilot she'd mentored, it all came back in that single instant. And now those young pilots outside were carrying that same spirit forward. A small tear formed in the corner of her eye, but she blinked it away quickly. She didn't want anyone to see. The F-22s rocked their wings again before veering off slightly to the right. The movement was clean and deliberate. Then, as if to mark the end of their silent message, they climbed higher, catching the last streak of sunlight before fading into the clouds. Applause broke out in the cabin. The passengers clapped, some laughing, others recording. The man beside her joined in, still looking amazed. "That was for you," he said in awe. "They actually did that for you." The woman smiled quietly, the kind of smile that carried years of memory. "It's not for me," she said softly. "It's for what came before me and everyone who helped them get there." The passengers continued talking excitedly, trying to piece together the story. Some asked her questions, but she only gave gentle answers. "Yes, I used to fly. No, I don't anymore. Yes, those jets are beautiful." She didn't brag or elaborate. She didn't need to. When the cabin lights dimmed further and the world outside turned dark, the excitement slowly faded into quiet reflection. People returned to their seats, still whispering occasionally, glancing her way with quiet admiration. The woman rested her head back, finally allowing herself to exhale. She thought about how life had changed since her days in uniform, the endless checklists, the weight of responsibility, the long nights wondering if she'd done enough. She had walked away from it years ago, thinking she'd left that chapter behind. But tonight, high above the clouds, the sky had reached back for her. She looked out again, but the F-22s were gone now, just memories fading into the darkness. Yet something deep inside her felt lighter. The silence of the cabin felt peaceful, not lonely. She realized that even though she no longer flew, a part of her always would. The flight attendants began preparing for the next service, their movements soft and professional. One of them stopped beside her one last time, lowering her voice. "I don't know what you did up there before, but whatever it was, it must have meant something." The woman smiled kindly. "It did, and it still does." The attendant nodded with quiet respect and walked away. The woman in 20D leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes, and let the hum of the engines carry her thoughts. The sky outside stretched endlessly, and though the world around her moved on, she knew she had just witnessed something rare, a silent moment of honor shared between past and present. Somewhere far ahead, the F-22 pilots continued their mission, but she knew they'd remember this flight too. The salute they gave wasn't part of their orders. It was something personal, something that came from the heart of every pilot who ever learned to trust the sky. And as the plane continued north, the woman's reflection faded into the dark window, her quiet smile remaining, the kind only someone who had truly touched the clouds could wear. The cabin had grown quiet again after the excitement. The F-22s were gone, swallowed by the fading light outside, but the passengers were still whispering about what they had seen. Everyone had a version of the story to tell. How the fighter jets appeared, how they seemed to salute the plane, and how they called out a seat number from thousands of feet below. It was the kind of moment that didn't happen on an ordinary flight. In the middle of it all, the woman in 20D sat still. She had hardly moved since the announcement. Her eyes were distant, lost somewhere between the present and a time long gone. The reflection of the cabin light shimmered faintly on the window beside her, but she wasn't looking at herself. She was looking beyond at the sky that had once been her home. The captain had stepped out of the cockpit a few minutes earlier and made his way to her seat. He carried a quiet look of respect, the kind you don't see often. He waited until she looked up before speaking. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I wanted to thank you. That was something special to witness. The entire crew is still talking about it." She smiled faintly. "They're good pilots," she said. "The kind that don't forget where they came from." The captain nodded slowly, still unsure if he should ask the question burning in his mind. But curiosity won. "If you don't mind my asking," he said, "who are you to them?" There was a long pause. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Finally, she said, "I used to fly. A long time ago." The captain raised his eyebrows slightly. "Military?" "Yes, I was a test pilot," she replied simply. "I helped train the early F-22 crews, back when those planes were still more theory than reality." The captain blinked in surprise. "You helped train the Raptors?" She gave a small nod, her voice calm and steady. "I didn't do it alone. There was a whole team of us. Engineers, mechanics, pilots. We were all just trying to make something that could handle the future. We took a lot of risks back then." The captain stood quietly for a moment, unsure what to say. Then he smiled. The kind of smile that came from genuine admiration. "That's incredible. I think those pilots out there knew exactly who you were." Her eyes softened. "Maybe, but that salute wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who worked behind the scenes, everyone who didn't make it into the spotlight." The captain nodded again, clearly moved. "Would you mind if I shared that with the crew?" "Of course not," she said. "Just don't make a big scene out of it. I'd rather keep things quiet." He smiled knowingly. "Understood. The sky remembers, though. I think you know that better than anyone." She smiled in return, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. When he walked back toward the cockpit, a few nearby passengers gave her small, respectful looks. They didn't say anything, but the understanding was there. A quiet admiration for the woman who had once shaped the very planes that now saluted her from the clouds. For the next while, the cabin fell into that peaceful in-between time of flight. The lights dimmed, the sky outside darkened completely, and the stars began to appear, small, distant, steady. The woman leaned back, her mind drifting through memories she hadn't visited in years. She remembered her first solo flight, the trembling excitement in her hands as she gripped the controls, the sound of her instructor's voice through the headset saying, "You're ready. Trust yourself." She remembered the feeling of the plane lifting under her, the sudden quiet that came when the wheels left the ground, the shock of realizing she was alone in the air, and the peace that followed. She remembered the endless training hours, the failures that taught her more than success ever could, the long days in the hangars, the smell of fuel and metal, the nights spent studying wind charts and engine data. She remembered laughing with her crew after tough missions, and the silence after the day one of them didn't come back. She had built her life around the sky. Every milestone, every scar, every friendship, all of it tied to those years in uniform. But then one test flight changed everything. It had been a routine mission testing a new stabilization system. She had done hundreds before. But that day, a mechanical fault turned into a fight for survival. She barely managed to land. Her hands were steady during the emergency, but when the wheels hit the ground, something inside her shifted. The recovery took months. Physically, she healed. But the quiet part of her, the part that loved the risk, the challenge, the feeling of belonging to the sky, never quite came back the same. She left the Air Force after that. It wasn't a bitter goodbye, just a quiet one. She'd always told herself she didn't regret it. But deep down she missed it more than she could ever explain. The roar of engines, the rush of adrenaline, the endless horizon that never asked questions, and now, sitting in seat 20D on a simple commercial flight, that world had found her again. The flight attendant who had spoken to her earlier approached once more, holding 2 cups of coffee. She placed one gently on the woman's tray table. "Compliments of the captain," she said with a smile. "He said you'd probably appreciate the strong blend." The woman chuckled softly. "That's kind of him." The attendant hesitated, then asked quietly, "What was it like?" "Flying those jets, I mean." The woman thought for a moment before answering. "It was everything. It was freedom, fear, and discipline all at once. You had to trust the machine, but you also had to trust yourself. It wasn't just about skill. It was about Hart. The attendant nodded slowly, clearly touched. You must have loved it. I did, she said, her voice almost a whisper. And I still do. Even when I stopped flying, I never stopped looking up. The attendant smiled softly, not sure how to respond, and walked away. The woman sipped her coffee, the warmth grounding her in the present moment. The plane continued through the night sky, cruising at 35,000 feet. Outside, the world was silent, endless, beautiful. She rested her hand lightly against the cold window and whispered under her breath, "Still feels like home." Then, from the corner of her eye, a faint glimmer appeared, distant lights in formation. For a second, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but no, it was real. The F-22s were back, flying at a higher altitude now, just far enough to be seen. They didn't approach. They simply stayed in view for a moment, a silent escort one last time before peeling off into the darkness. A small tear formed again, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, a quiet acknowledgement of something deeper than words. By the time the flight began its descent toward Anchorage, the cabin was calm. The passengers were relaxed, unaware that they had been part of something unforgettable. The woman gathered her thoughts, her bag still neatly under the seat, her posture as steady as ever. When the captain made the final announcement, his voice carried a warmth it hadn't before. Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our approach, I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone special on board tonight. We've had the honor of flying with a former Air Force test pilot, whose work helped shape the very aircraft that safeguard our skies today. On behalf of the crew, we'd like to thank her for her service. Applause filled the cabin. It wasn't loud or forced, and it was genuine, full of quiet respect. The woman smiled modestly, her cheeks slightly flushed. She didn't turn around, didn't wave, just nodded once in appreciation. The man beside her leaned in, his voice soft. That must feel nice, she smiled gently. It does. But it feels even better knowing they're still out there, flying the way we dreamed they would. As the plane touched down, the landing lights of the runway flickered beneath them like tiny stars. The woman felt the wheels hit the ground, a familiar jolt she hadn't felt in years, and smiled. When the plane slowed to a taxi, the passengers began to gather their things, still glancing her way. She waited until most had left before standing. She thanked the crew quietly as she passed. One of the attendants said softly, "You'll always have the sky with you, won't you?" She nodded. Always. When she stepped into the terminal, the cool air met her face. She paused for a moment, looking out the window at the airfield. In the distance, 2 F-22s sat parked near the edge of the tarmac, their silhouettes glowing under floodlights. As if sensing her presence, one of them rocked its wings slightly, just a little movement in the wind. She smiled to herself, whispered a simple thank you, and walked on into the night. Not a hero seeking attention, but a pilot whose sky had finally spoken back. The plane began its slow descent toward Anchorage, and the cabin filled with that soft hum that always came at the end of a long flight. People started stretching, pulling down their bags and chatting again. But this time the talk wasn't about work or vacations. Every single person on board had only one thing on their mind: the woman who sat quietly in seat 20D. For most of the flight, she had been invisible to them, just another traveler on a routine journey. But after the salute from the F-22s and the whispers that followed, she had become the center of quiet attention. The passengers kept glancing toward her, trying not to stare. Some smiled when she caught their eyes, as if to say they were proud, though they didn't even know her name. She didn't seem to notice the attention. She sat still, her hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed on the window. Below, the Alaskan mountains stretched endlessly, their snowy peaks glowing under the soft light of the setting sun. The sight made her heart feel heavy and light at the same time. She had seen this view many times before, once from the cockpit of a jet, now from a passenger seat. Life had changed, but the sky still felt like home. A flight attendant passed by and quietly leaned toward her. "Captain asked me to check if you're comfortable," she said in a low voice. The woman gave a small smile. "I'm fine. Tell him thank you." The attendant nodded and hesitated for a moment, then whispered, "Everyone's talking about what happened. I've never seen fighter pilots do that before." The woman's eyes softened. "They didn't do it for the passengers," she said gently. "They did it for someone who used to fly with them." The attendant gave her a respectful nod. There was something deeply moving about her calmness. No pride, no ego, just quiet understanding. When the landing gear dropped and the engines changed pitch, the cabin grew silent again. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and warm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts. And before we arrive, I'd like to share something special with you." Every head turned. Even the children stopped talking. The woman in 20D looked up, already sensing what was coming. "Today," the captain continued, "we had the honor of carrying a passenger who has contributed greatly to the aviation world, someone who flew higher and faster than most of us ever will. The salute you saw earlier from the F-22 pilots wasn't random. It was a gesture of respect for her service. Though she never asked for recognition, I think we should all take a moment to thank her for her dedication and courage." For a moment, there was complete silence. Then slowly a wave of applause filled the cabin. People turned toward her, clapping, smiling, nodding. Some stood just to see her face clearly. She looked down, her cheeks faintly red. She wasn't used to this kind of attention anymore. It had been years since she wore a flight suit or walked on an airfield. Still, hearing the sound of people appreciating what she once did filled her chest with warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. When the plane touched down, she remained seated until the aisle cleared a little. She didn't rush. The older couple beside her thanked her quietly. The man said, "Our grandson wants to be a pilot. He'd be proud to meet someone like you." She smiled. "Tell him to keep dreaming. The sky's worth it." The woman took her small carry-on and stood, pausing one last time to glance out the window. Outside, the tarmac glistened in the cold light. Near the edge of the runway, 2 F-22s were parked side by side, their sleek gray bodies reflecting the fading sun. As the passengers disembarked, one of the jet's canopies lifted. The pilot inside turned his head toward the commercial plane and raised his gloved hand in a salute. She stood in the aisle, frozen for a second, her eyes locked on the figure. Then she smiled, softly, almost invisibly, and lifted her hand just slightly, a gesture only he might notice. The people behind her were too busy gathering their luggage to realize what had just happened. To them, she was just another traveler. But that quiet salute between the pilot and the woman in 20D said everything words couldn't. Outside the airport, the wind carried the faint sound of engines starting up again. She walked slowly toward the exit, feeling that old familiar vibration under her feet. For years, that sound had been her heartbeat. It reminded her of missions flown in the dark, of sky fields glowing under dawn light, of the weight of responsibility and the rush of freedom that came with every takeoff. She remembered the moment she had to leave it all behind, the day her injury grounded her for good. She thought she would never feel that sense of belonging again. But now, standing on solid ground, watching 2 fighter jets rise into the sky, she realized something. Maybe you never really stop belonging to the sky once it's part of you. As she waited for her bag, a young man from the crew approached her. He looked nervous but determined. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say, that was incredible. I've worked flights for years, but I've never seen something like that." "You must have been amazing up there." She gave a small laugh. "I did my best, but those young pilots up there, they're the ones carrying it forward now." He smiled, inspired just by her words. Still, they learned from the best. She shook his hand before walking toward the doors that led outside. The cold air hit her face, crisp and sharp. She took a deep breath, the kind that filled her lungs and made her feel alive. As she walked to the taxi area, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from a familiar contact, an old friend still serving at the base. The message was short. "Word travels fast. They said the Raptors saluted you. You deserve it." She stared at the message for a while before typing back, "They're doing great work. I'm proud of them." Then she slipped the phone back into her pocket and kept walking. A few minutes later, a taxi pulled up. The driver looked at her through the mirror and asked where she was headed. "Downtown Anchorage," she said softly. As the car pulled away, she glanced out at the horizon. The jets were barely visible now, just distant specks in the golden sky. But in her mind, she could still hear the roar of their engines, still feel the rush of air, still remember the thrill of pushing limits that few people ever knew. The driver noticed her smile in the mirror. "You like planes?" he asked casually. She nodded. "You could say that," he chuckled. "I used to dream of being a pilot when I was a kid. Seems like the best job in the world. She turned her gaze from the window and said, "It is. And sometimes the sky remembers you, even when you're no longer flying." The rest of the drive passed in peaceful silence. The city lights began to appear in the distance, small and steady like stars on the ground. She felt content, not because she was recognized, but because she had seen something rare, respect given freely, not demanded. When the taxi stopped outside a small hotel, she thanked the driver and stepped out. The wind tugged gently at her coat as she looked up at the darkening sky one last time. Somewhere far above, 2 fighter jets were still cutting through the clouds, and she knew that for a brief moment their paths had crossed again. Inside the hotel lobby, she walked quietly to the reception desk. The clerk greeted her with a polite smile, unaware of who she was or what had just happened. She signed her name, collected her keycard, and went to her room. As she unpacked, she placed a small framed photo on the nightstand, an old picture of her standing beside a fighter jet, helmet tucked under her arm, the wind blowing her hair back. For years, it had been her reminder of a life she thought was behind her, but tonight it felt different. She lay down on the bed, still dressed, and closed her eyes. The engines outside were gone now, replaced by quiet. But in her mind, she could hear them again, the thunderous echo of freedom, the call of the sky. The world might remember her as the woman who once sat quietly in seat 20D. But for those who truly understood, the pilots who had flown with her, the ones who saluted from above, she would always be something more. The soul of the sky, the quiet force who had inspired them all without ever asking to be seen. And as sleep slowly pulled her under, she smiled one last time, knowing that sometimes the greatest moments of recognition come not from applause, but from the silent salute of those who know your journey.